optimizing website on Google search result. That I've never gone back and learned how to. The whole background, yeah, I don't want any of that stuff. So, yeah, it's all yourself. Because I just knew like the very basic HTML. Stuff related to SEO, like knowing the title tag and response, keywords, basic web design, and WordPress. But as far as, yeah, all this, of course, I've learned a lot, but I'm still pretty lost.
It just takes a lot of time to
Yeah. I did SEO for a long time, so I know I can learn. So,
it just
I
takes
did
us
it in my 20s and 30s. But it's just a matter of, yeah.
There were a lot of replacement that didn't finish with me, and they were pretty and they just kind of got out since everything was previously could get really daunting. But I mean, as long as we can do it,
I haven't been to college, so most places.
instead,
Yeah, I'm like relearning how to study and stuff now. Because I haven't had to do it, at least in the classroom environment. I mean, I was always motivated with SEO because I was learning how to make money with the website. But this is, you know, it's a little too wrong.
everybody do like program stuff, it may be like more being there.
Yeah. That's why I'm like, I know everything builds on everything. So like,
As long as you know to use pretty much so big for us. It's pretty much like I didn't know anything about it. But mostly if I take a class that you know the semester they spend too much on detail. That it's not really this one's like that.
That's why I'm kind of wondering, like, when I go home and start doing that, because do it these schools. But how much of this stuff do I really need to understand to be ridiculous? To, you know, to build on everything.
All right, can Winston-Salem see the stream?
I wouldn't study it at home, but I think sorry for the elaborate. Because I just, at home, it's like, it's, you're not separated. But I was like, every 5 minutes, I could use my
You can't really stay at home.
Yeah.
There's a bed right in front of you.
Yeah.
And you can't go
Well, at least I'm not that bad, but no, for me, it's go check Facebook.
Oh, yeah. You got
Or,
distracted.
you know, all the things that
That you used to do that
at home, usually that's
more focus.
Get started in just a second. Okay. All right, so Winston-Salem's online. Hello, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to cover a couple little things that we kind of forgot to mention before lunch, and then go over kind of a pretty simple Ajax API demo. That'll just be another kind of iteration on what we were talking about before lunch, before we get started on the exercise, on the API exercise. So if you haven't seen in Slack during the lunch break, Ali fixed the thing on Node that wasn't allowing people externally to hit the site, and there's a very good reason why that wasn't working. So there's something called CORS, CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. So this is a security mechanism that's built into the internet that essentially says when you're hitting a web server, if the page that was loaded that's calling calling that web server didn't originate from that web server, to block it by default, right? So most web servers, most web application platforms these days are set up to have CORS enabled by default, okay? And that's what we were seeing before the break. We were trying to hit using local code, right? So things stored on localhost on our machine, trying to hit a web server that Ali had set up, and it was blocking it. So during the break, he kind of opened that up and said, anybody, whether you're hitting a web page on this site or whether you're coming in from wherever else, including our local desktops, it's okay. I'll accept traffic from here. Okay, so that's when you saw that origin error down in the when we were doing gets and everything. That's what that was all about. There's a very good reason why that's set up. It's there to prevent something called cross-site scripting, right? Imagine if you went to Facebook and filled out a web page, username and password. When you do that, you're downloading the web page from Facebook, and then and that web page kind of when you type in your username and password, that calls back into Facebook, right? So there's something that says only code, only pages that are downloaded from Facebook are allowed to post back to it, right? Like you couldn't create a website and then post your username and login to Facebook. Now you can do that through an API, and that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. But you can't do it, kind of directly. You couldn't create a form on your website that would like log into Facebook. Otherwise, you'd have kind of attacks from everywhere doing special things, right? Somebody could log into your website. You could say, hey, put in your username and password here, and you could log into Facebook from your website, and if it worked, you would know the person's Facebook password, right? So it's to prevent what's called cross-site scripting attacks. You might hear XSS attacks. And so, like I said, that CORS only allow current domain, only allow things that are downloaded from this site to post back to this site, is usually turned on by default, and that's what we had to turn off. So we talked about on the first day kind of domains, like domain names, right? And then we talked about localhost. So you noticed before when Ali had localhost :3000, he was running against localhost port 3000. That was that special name. If y'all remember back from the first day that we opened up the host file, and there was that special file, and we had 127.0.0.1, and that's localhost. It's like when you're doing that loop back to this computer. It's like the domain for your own computer. That's what was happening. When you open up a page on your computer, your domain is localhost, and then we were trying to post to, another website. Now, when you're testing applications locally, most of the time when we're doing web development, right? Most of the time when you're doing web development, you're doing stuff locally. So the test server that you're running against, and your web application are both local. So you're going to be putting in localhost, and it's usually port 3000 or 4000, something like that. And in that case, you're not going to get these cross-site scripting errors because you're essentially downloading the file locally, the web page, and you're posting locally to your own web server. And that's why sometimes you might not get an error there, and then when you push things out to a test server or a production server, all of a sudden there are all these problems. And it's because it works differently when it's on your own machine. So that's what that was all about. But that's important to know, because that's something. If you ever see down in the browser bar something about origin or cross origin domain, if you ever see an error like that, that's what's going on. You can also get this sometimes when you include a script. So at the top of your files, you can include different JavaScripts or CSS files. If you're using one from another site, which you can do, it's called like using something from a CDN. You can, instead of people downloading JavaScripts from your site, they can download them from another site. You can kind of use them within your page. Sometimes when you do that, if your site runs HTTP, if it runs unsecurely, and the file that you're downloading is HTTPS, like the JavaScript that you're referencing on the internet, is different, like one's secure and one's insecure, or vice versa. If you're running securely and that's insecure, you'll also see this kind of a cross origin sharing problem. The browser doesn't like to mix things that are kind of secure and unsecure, because then it kind of, if you see the green lock up in the corner of your browser, you want to think like, okay, everything on this page is secure between me and the server. And if it was allowing things that that were running over port 80 over an unencrypted channel, the browser would be kind of lying to you. So all that being said, let's take a look at a really, really simple example. Let's kind of take a step back and look at a really, really simple Ajax application. So y'all all remember the one of the first examples that we did, one of the first dynamic examples we did was clicking on a button and showing time, showed like today's date. So we're going to do that again, but we're going to do that with using jQuery and making an Ajax call to an API. Over just a second. All right. Is everybody in Winston okay? Got audio? Good now? Good now. Okay. All right. So this is a very, very simple HTML page. Let me bump up the size a little bit. So y'all should recognize this by now, right? I've got just a project over here, a CSS file, very, very simple. We'll look at that because we look at that and then kind of bypass it because there's not a whole lot in there. All I'm doing is setting the font size on the buttons and body to make a bigger button there. So that's all that's in there. In my JavaScript folder, I'm referencing jQuery. That should look familiar by now. And then I've got a main JavaScript file here. That's where I'm going to keep all of my code. So that's what's in those folders. And then we've got this index here. So in the head, again, all I'm doing is referencing those three things. I've got my style sheet here on line 6, referencing that in, referencing jQuery, and then my main JavaScript file. Now, why do lines 7 and 8 have to be that way? Could I switch out my JavaScript file above, so it's above jQuery? Like, could I swap lines 7 and 8? Would that work?
Yeah.
If you are not.
If I'm referencing jQuery in that main JS file, would that break something, or would that be okay? It would break it. Yeah. Why is that? It doesn't know, it hadn't loaded it yet, right? So if I'm referencing jQuery in this main JavaScript file, and just this code file that I made where my JavaScript is going to live, if I switch them like this would have a problem, right? Because it would sort of say, well, what is this $sign you're talking about, right? This jQuery reference is what loads all the jQuery stuff in there and sort of tells it what what the $sign is and what all the jQuery pieces are. So if you remember this, if you remember one thing about kind of the head tag, it's reference all of your things in the order in which they need to load. So we're going to talk about Bootstrap in another hour or two. Bootstrap usually kind of loads first, then you've got your plugins underneath that, and then you've got your sites CSS kind of at the bottom. Same thing with JavaScript. You're going to have your jQuery first, or your main, kind of your main platform JavaScript. Then you're going to have like your jQuery plugins, and then you're going to have your site code sort of last. So it kind of knows about everything that you're loading before it references it in code. So does everybody understand kind of what this head's doing? Y'all have seen this a couple times. Should start looking familiar. Just loading in CSS and JavaScript. There's not a whole lot going on this body, right? Very, very simple. So all I've got here is a button. Because this is kind of a named button and it's going to do something, a single function, there's only one of them, I added an ID, get time. So that's what that button's going to do. It looks like this. Just a giant button, get the time. I've got a little paragraph underneath that, time container. Doesn't need to be a paragraph. Could be a div tag. Could be a span tag. Whatever whatever one. It's a little holding bucket for where I'm going to put the value when I get the time. So down here, this should look familiar. Just a little script tag at the bottom of the page. Document ready. That's just saying all ready is, like Ali was saying, is an event. So you've got document is the main. The main object of the page. Ready is basically saying, hey, let me wire up to your ready event so that when you're ready, you can do what? You can call back, right? You can give me a callback. These functions that you put in an event handler are generally called callbacks, right? So document ready basically says, here's my ready event. What do you want to do, right? Well, I just want to call a function. I want to call a callback. Now that document ready could take a millisecond. It could take a second. It could take 20 seconds. I mean, hopefully not, right? Hopefully your page didn't take 20 seconds to load. But the point being is it's not, this code runs only when the document is finished loading, and it fires that ready event on the document, right? So you don't have to kind of guess or get in a race condition or sort of, run at the right time. You can just say, sort of lean back into that API and say, I'm just going to trust you when you're ready. Call this callback, and that callback is going to be this function right here. So just an anonymous function, right? Doesn't have a name. Just call a function, and within that function, I'm going to call bind click event. Okay. So if I go back over here to my code, here's my bind click event function, right? So this is the method that I'm calling. This is the function that I'm calling when my document loads up. Normally with jQuery, this is where you're going to do all your binding, right? So we looked at in the first week kind of having a button with like an on-click event right inside the HTML. With jQuery, we're really gonna bind things up kind of behind the scenes. Like you're going to go through and say, here are all my selectors that I'm interested in binding events to. Ali talked about event handlers. So normally you would see a lot of these. When your page loads, it's like, go find all my buttons and assign a click event. Go find all my drop downs and assign like an on change event maybe, right? If we wanted our drop downs, y'all have seen those things on the internet where you pick from a drop down list and then it like filters the other one. All that's doing is looking at the on change event from that first drop down and then filling it dynamically with the results, relative to the first one. So like Ali said, there's click events, focus events, on blur, which means as you're typing like in a text box, for example, and then you tab out of it, that means blur. It's like, okay, I've changed something here. So I'm posting all this code, by the way, kind of in the exercise break after this. So y'all don't have to copy this. I'll post it all into GitHub. Okay, so let's take a look at what this is doing here. And you can see I've kind of commented some things. There's an API URL that essentially, it's a world clock API. Somebody's just created this service and put it out on the internet. And if you go to this URL here, they've got usually an API. This is a pretty common pattern here, where you've got the main URL of a website and then /API. That's a real common place where people put APIs, right? and that differentiates it between the regular application. So if you logged into Facebook, it might be https ://facebook.com. If you are interacting programmatically, right, if your program was talking to Facebook, it might do it on facebook.com/API, right? And that basically tells it like, here's all of our API code, here's all of our machines talking to machines area, right? And it's not in the main area of the application. So you'll see that a lot. Sometimes you have an XML API versus a JSON API, right? There's different protocols and different formats of sending messages across the wire. JSON is definitely the most popular now, and I don't think XML is making a comeback, but sometimes you'll see that. Sometimes you'll see legacy APIs with big XML documents. So this is pretty easy to read. Okay, API, I want the JSON API, EST, Eastern Standard Time, /now. Right, so if we just open this in a browser, this looks, let me see, make that a little bigger. This looks pretty familiar, right? This is sort of very similar to what I was doing before. It just gets back a big document, with a bunch of properties in it. So now we're gonna use this and call in to this API and set the time on our page, right? So the first thing we're going to do when get time, that's that button, right? So we're going to assign a click event to it, and the click event is called what? What's that click event called? Event handler, right? So that's the event handler. We're going to say find me the button, right? That's our selector, jQuery selector. Click event, that's the event handler, and then what does that take? That just takes a function, right? That function is a callback. What do you want to do when this is clicked? What code do you want me to call back into? Remember, Ali was talking about asynchronous processing. So this is wired up something. What you've told jQuery to do here is in the background, wire up an event handler so that whenever user interaction happens with that page, whenever you click on that, the browser is going to say, hey, I remember I had a connection. I remember I had wiring, right? That was bound to this. What do I need to go do? And internally, it's kind of like the click event sort of maps to this code, right? So when you click it, it's like this is what's going to run. So I'm calling this right here, get time with Ajax. This is just another way, and we're going to go through this one piece at a time. This is just another way. This is another version of jQuery's Ajax call, right? So if you look in the documentation under Ajax, which is here, and I'll post this into Slack as well. Go ahead and do that. Okay, so this is kind of what we were looking at before, that big API page. There's several different ways you can do it. This one in particular, this method signature. So you'll hear about functions. Functions can have different kinds of parameters, right? So you may have a function that's named the same thing with one parameter or two, or two with different kinds of objects or options in a big option object. So that's the case with this one. So you'll see that I'm calling this API URL, right, which just points to this little link right here. I'm using method get, and I could put all the other kinds of information in here. I could put there are all kinds of other properties in here that I could add. But this is kind of the minimalistic set, right? It's like, where do you want to go and how do you want to get it, right? So we're using method get here. We want to kind of go get something. We're not posting anything, we're not pushing anything or deleting anything, we're not manipulating objects. We're just getting that information. So we're going to use that HTTP get verb. This done down here, done, fail, and always. What are these things? What is this right here? All this is a different way of doing those callbacks, right? So think about this. This is just an event. These are just events on the Ajax call. Remember, whenever you're calling Ajax, it's asynchronous, right? So you're basically saying, go get this stuff. I'm not going to sit here and wait for you. I've got other things to do, right? I'm going to go ahead and process, or I may continue on with my for loop or do other things. but I'm going to spawn up another thread. It's like, think about threads as like workers. So you've got kind of one worker going down there, and then you say, hey, I got to keep doing this. Can you go do this for me, right? So you're spawning up another thread. That's making this network call. It's calling out to go get this data, and it's doing its own thing. And then say you've got the one person kind of working on something, the other one comes back, taps him on the shoulder, and says, hey, I finished. Here's your stuff, right? That's the callback. That's that one thread saying, hey, I'm done. Let me tell the main execution thread, let me tell the main kind of program that's running that I'm finished, right? So that's all these are. This done right here is the same thing as, remember that success object that Ali showed? It was like success and then kind of a function callback. That's all this is right here, dot done. It's like a different way of doing it. There's lots of different ways of doing Ajax. Whichever one is, that you like the best, you go ahead and use it. So this is saying done. And then I've got a callback function, right? What do you want me to do? Well, I'm gonna take data, whatever you give back to me, right? Which in this case is going to be a JSON object, and I'm going to do some stuff with it, right? So I'm gonna log out, got the data, and then I'm gonna log out to the console, the actual data, right? Because the console is really nice. It'll actually, show that object in a nice formatted way. And then right here, I'm going to set my time container, right, which is this little paragraph tag right here. That's where I kind of want to stuff the result, right, into that HTML. I'm going to say time container .html. That's how I set the HTML of it. And then I'm going to call this method with my data. I'm going to call this function right here. And all this does, it's just a clean way, instead of doing this, kind of in line here, I'm just going to pass in that object and then do my string manipulation inside that. Remember, every function should have kind of a primary responsibility, right? This one's called get time string from data, right? Very specific. Even if I had this closed, I could say, what do you think that does, right? Get time string from data, and I pass it data. What do you think that returns? What do you think that gives back? The formatted time string, right? So all I'm doing there is string concatenation. Y'all have seen this a million times. It is, and then that data object has day of week. If we look over here, let's call that again so we can kind of take a look at it. So you see this has got a bunch of different things, right? It's got day of week and time zone information and, kind of the current date time and bunch of different things, right? So basically we're saying it is this day of week, the time is this, this time, and I'm going to put the time zone in parentheses here. So that's all it's doing, and you'll notice that dot property access, right? So data is an object, and so if we want to get at the things in an object, we use dot whatever the property name is, right? Or you can use the brackets and use the name. So you could have something like, oops, sorry. You have something like that, which it does the exact same thing. It's just a way of that kind of looks like the index notation, but it's basically saying, index into this object with this name. It's kind of like a dictionary. It's looking up that value by the property name, essentially. Same type of deal. You'll mostly see people use dot notation because it's a little bit easier to read. So does that make sense? That's all that's doing there is string concatenation. So let's give it a try. Let's see what we get here. Okay. So does that make sense? And you'll notice down here, if I go to the network tab, when I click this button, see, now that we're doing Ajax, you're going to start seeing things happening, right? On a dynamic web page, you can be on the same page as you're clicking stuff. You're going to see all kinds of activity down here in the network tab, because even though you're not refreshing the page, you're not going to a new page, you're still doing network access, right? You're like talk to site A, talk to site B, bring some information out, together, concatenate it, that kind of thing. And so this tab right here, the network tab, is going to be really helpful in kind of debugging what you're sending and what you're getting back, and it'll show errors here, right? Network errors like, hey, you get a 404, I couldn't find it. that means that, oh, I've got the wrong URL, right? I'm calling it kind of with the wrong thing. If you get a 500 error, like a server error, maybe you're calling it with the wrong data. Maybe it's confused. It's sort of, it sort of is broken on that side. So this network tab is going to be really, really handy for you. And you can see here, let's see if I can zoom this in a little bit. You can see right here, this is what I'm getting back. So I'm doing a get at this location. You'll notice here, see this allow control, access control, allow origin. That means on this site they have cores turned off, or they say this star here means like it's cool, everybody's cool. Everybody can come and use me from wherever they want, right? That usually is not set to star. It's usually set to only from this site. That's that core stuff I was talking about. Because this allows access from wherever, that's what's enabling us from from a local file here to call out to the internet and access that. This one's kind of like open. There's a couple other things. We haven't really talked about headers yet, but you'll notice that, see this content encoding gzip? All that means is what they're sending back is compressed. So it's telling the browser, hey, on the other side, go ahead and like unzip it and compress it. Just allows the server to kind of make the payload smaller as it goes across the internet. And then on the receiving side, it sort of unzips all the text. It's a way of doing it in a kind of a smaller way. Application JSON, that's the content type that it's sending me back, right? All these things are saying, please send me JSON back. That's kind of what it's expecting. And then sometimes you can even see right here, X powered by ASP.NET. We know it's a .NET server, which is what we're going to be learning, C#. We know that this site is a .NET, is running IIS. So like sometimes the headers give you little clues in there. You can see that it's running IIS server. That's the web server, version 10. So if you look through all these headers, you can kind of get a little bit of information about what's on the other side. It kind of leaks a little bit of information about what's going on the other side. But you can see here, you get a nice preview view of this is sort of what the data looks like. But again, the Chrome developer tools are like, hey, let me put that in a nice little format for you. This gets really really handy when you have a giant object coming back that may have 300 other embedded objects, right, in different arrays, and you can kind of fold up the different areas. Like say you had an array here with 100 things in it, you could kind of go through one at a time and look at them, and kind of explore that object coming back. In this case is real simple, but you can see how all these parts are in here, right? Monday, I grabbed that from day of the week. The time, I grabbed that from current date time. Eastern Standard Time, I grabbed that from there. So you can see how you can start kind of composing these objects with string interpolation and concatenation. You can kind of bring back data from a service and then display it however you want to. This could just as easily be like World Cup events, right, or standings, right? So it could be 100 different matches, and you could loop through that and say, this was the winner versus this. Here's the score, or whatever. You could just, in one single call, you can get back all the information and then build out that table that I was looking at this morning, where you have like sports scores. So does that kind of make sense to everybody? Any questions? Any questions from Winston-Salem? Okay, all right, so AJAX calls are written as done. Okay, so yeah, I didn't finish. Let me finish going through this. So okay, so done is what happens when there's kind of a success. So it's giving you the data back. Fail is another callback, right, that you can set up that if something went wrong, if there's an error, if there's a 500 error, if there's a server error, something like that, if something goes wrong on the AJAX call, then you can do something here, right? You might put up a little alert or notice or something for the user. Hey, something broke here, something went wrong here. Always is just a way of saying that whether it was a success or whether it was a failure, always do this. It's like no matter what. So this would be, instead of writing something twice, instead of writing some code here, whether it's failure, or here, whether it's successful, if you wanted something to happen no matter what, you could kind of put it in always, So it's kind of, success case, failure case, and then happens every time no matter what. Now there's a shortcut. So we looked at how to use Ajax here, right? Since we're just doing a get, though, isn't there an easier way than kind of like writing out all this stuff? Gets are usually pretty simple. It's like I send you a URL and maybe a parameter or two, and give me back what I'm looking for. It's a pretty simple case. So let's switch over here. Let's use a different method here. So instead of get time with Ajax, let's get time using the get, kind of the shortcut, right? Whoa, look at that, right? Like that's way shorter, way nicer, and really a little bit easier to read, right? Because instead of calling Ajax, with type of get, it's like let's just put it right. Let's make it very explicit. Let's put it right here in the name of the function, right? It's like let's tell it what we're doing. Let's be explicit about it. So $.get is the same thing as calling $.ajax with like get and with a bunch of other properties set, right? It's got really good defaults, and all you're doing is using the URL there, and then adding your callback. So you can make things really kind of you can make your code really tight. I mean, if you're thinking about what we're doing here, it's like we're clicking on a button and then we're doing something in basically one line. We're calling out to the internet and then doing something with one line of code there. So you can imagine how powerful some of this stuff gets, and you can keep your code pretty small and compact. There are also convenience methods just like that for $.post, $.delete. All the different HTTP verbs. Post will take a different thing. It'll take a URL, and then you'll have some data here, right? Because you're usually posting some data back, right? So you'd have like a little object there that you want to post back to the server. So they have different signatures, but the point is there's all these. There's always an easier way to do it. There's always kind of a shorter way to do it. And so these little shortcuts, these little get and post shortcuts. If you want to do the most common things with Ajax, you saw how many options there were back on this page under Ajax. Like you can see how complex this gets, right? Like how many things are in here. Look at all of these things. Well, all these come in handy, and you'll use them over time. You'll use them for certain situations, but 99% of the time, you're only going to use certain parameters, right? And so those get and post and other sort of convenience factors will kind of take the most common settings and set those as defaults. And so all you have to call is like where you want to call in and a callback, that kind of thing. And you can see even the documentation for it is easier, right? It's like, that's how long the get the documentation for that get shortcut is, right? So it's, once you know kind of those things to look for, if you're doing the most common cases, it's best to use those really. And you can see here, this right here is equivalent to that. Just calling that right there. So is everybody kind of clear on general Ajax stuff, just getting stuff from a website? That's what we're going to be doing, over the next couple of days. Any questions? Any other questions from Winston-Salem before we move on?
I think that guy added to his question.
Okay. So done is yeah. So all of these calls back here. Let me pop this back open. So done and fail and always. When this Ajax call is made, it returns kind of the Ajax object as a. So Ali talked about fluent interfaces the other day, just briefly. Essentially, this call returns itself when it's done. So basically it's saying like make an AJAX call and then call done on it. And when you're done adding this function, this callback for done, return itself, so you can call fail on it, and then return itself, call always. So you could do this in 4 different steps, right? You could create a variable and then like add a done event to it, add a fail event to it, and add an always. But for things that return themselves, for functions that return its own, the object again, you can kind of chain them together. You can kind of call function, function, function. You've seen this in jQuery, right? Where it's like you get a selector and then you hide it and then you add a style to it and then you whatever. jQuery works the same way. Whenever you get a selector and you call something on it, it returns itself. And so then you can call something else on it and then it returns itself. And you call, so it's all the way down. You can kind of chain as many together as you want. And in this case, AJAX does the same thing. Yep.
Why don't you need the $sign?
Why? So the question is, why don't you need the $sign on that? So you're already in the context. The $sign, again, is just like the jQuery. It's just a shortcut for jQuery. You could spell out jQuery here. It's just an alias for that. It's a shortcut for that. Once you're saying, hey jQuery, that's kind of the root object of everything in jQuery is like $sign. That's like the main object, right? And so then you just start calling methods on it. Selectors are a method. All these other things are just essentially a method on this $sign. Once you've already done that, once you've already called dot and have a reference to, hey, this is jQuery, then you're just calling a method on jQuery. So you're saying, hey jQuery, go do AJAX. And then it returns kind of it's what's called a promise. It returns essentially an object, an AJAX object that you can then call done on, then you can call fail on, then you can call always. So it's because you've already got the context is the answer to that. So like you already know you're in jQuery and you've already called a method on it and you've gotten back like the same thing. Which is like the equivalent of doing, like this thing. Like we could put this in a variable. We could do something like that and then say like test.done, right? And then chain it. So, but because it's already kind of chainable essentially, we don't need to do that. It already kind of knows that it's in the context of jQuery there, yeah. Any other questions on this one? Okay. So let's take a look back. Let's see. All right, so here, bless you. So here is the public API for the tally, the vote API that Ali set up. And actually, let me look at one more here. Okay, so here's the list of APIs. All right, so let's look at this in here so we can make it nicer. So you remember when I said this is kind of like a crazy unreadable block of text, right? It's sort of hard to deal with. But you remember if I mention the network tab here, so let's look at this. See how this kind of cleans this up? Essentially, when you call APIs, this is like the list of APIs that are available. These are the things that we're going to vote on to see what we talk about tomorrow as far as APIs. So this is just an array, right? You see like the brackets here. This is basically an array of objects. So we pop this open and it's like, okay, so array element 0, right? Array element 0 right here, array element 1. These are all the pieces of the array. Inside the array, you've got objects. So if we pop those open, you'll see each one's got a name and an ID. Those are the only 2 properties there. Spotify, y'all familiar with that? Like the music service, they have an API, right? Like you can, I don't know exactly what it does, but I imagine you can like call it to start a song up. You can probably call it to say, what song am I playing right now? That kind of thing. You can sort of talk to it programmatically, right? Instead of using their website, you could build a Spotify front end, right? A Spotify website that's like 1,000 times better than Spotify. And instead of using their website, you can call out, go get me this song and play it. Go do this. Go, add this to my playlist, whatever. think of APIs as ways of interacting with services and sites programmatically. So like your code is talking to it, not you're talking to a website through, a web browser interface. This is like, how does my code talk to this site and kind of control it? Yep.
So could you take like the API for Spotify and SoundCloud and like another music?
Yes. Great question. Absolutely, right? It's called a mashup, right? So the question was, can you take an API from Spotify and what was the other one?
Like
SoundCloud and like Apple Music, whatever, and kind of like mix and match all together. Yes, and in fact, those are called mashups, right? So there are entire sites on the internet where the people who set them up have written no server-side code whatsoever, right? All they've done is written a web page that pulls all these other services in and kind of combines them in really cool ways, right? So there was one a while back called Chicago Crime Stats or something like that, where it would show different like crimes across like Chicago on a map, something like that. I think Richmond had one too at one point. But essentially, what they were doing was going out and grabbing like the police API of like where crimes happened, getting the lat long coordinates for that, then taking the Google Maps API and pulling that in and like plotting it on the map, right? So there are people that do that with music services, like bring things together and like kind of mix and match playlists, things like that. So without writing any back-end code at all, without writing any web server code, server-side code at all, you can use all of these public APIs to talk to things. I could have something where if somebody played, if my friend on Spotify using the Spotify API, if they played a certain song that I texted them earlier, to give me a text message on Twilio, use Twilio to send me a text message that said, hey, your buddy played your song, right? And that's like a mashup. So without writing any kind of server-side code, I've just like using different people's public APIs can make kind of new functionality, like new unintended functionality, or intended by you, but unintended by them. There are sites out there. Has anybody heard of If Then Then That? IFTT. Yeah, so there are a couple of things. There are a couple of sites like that now. It's IFTT if you want to look it up. It's pretty cool. That basically does the same thing, right? And they use server-side code, but they do ways of creating programs like on the internet. And basically all they're doing is using all of these APIs and saying, if you get an email with this in it, text this to your buddy, right? And they're using this API and they're using this API, kind of tying them together. If your parents call you, turn on your light at home, like turn on like a red light in your office or something, using another API in your internet attached light bulb. So that's all these are. These are just public APIs. Twilio, Spotify, Slack. Y'all are familiar with that. We've been using it all week. Twitter, GitHub. Looks like Nutrition and Restaurant Database, CoinDesk, Reddit. I mean, there's a bunch of them in here. 17 different ones. Flickr, Google Translate. How cool would it be to take an API? Maybe you had an API that was on a website in Germany, right? How cool would it be to take data from their API, run it through Google Translate, and basically recreate their API for their data in English? You could do that. You could create something that somebody hasn't made yet. Google Maps and Leaflet.js right here, this one. Everybody's familiar with Google Maps probably. Leaflet.js, that's a library to make note of if you're ever going to use maps online. It's a great way of essentially using different types of mapping technologies. So you got Google Maps and Bing Maps, and there's OpenStreetMaps, which is kind of like the Wikipedia for maps. You can actually go in and if you see a mistake on it, you can go in and change it. So it's like Wikipedia where it takes like public changes. You can go in and make changes, or if something's missing on your local neighborhood map, you can go and add it in. But Leaflet is Leaflet's a JavaScript library that sits over top of all those, and you can kind of change out your back-end map. Like you can switch them and swap them. But you can still write kind of a single application, single code base And then if you ever want to change your mapping provider, you can just change that with like one line of code. Image recognition with AI, that's cool. You know, Pokemon, Google Translate, Flickr, Google Calendar. So these are all the APIs out there. Once we start the exercise where y'all be voting, go take a look at some of those if you're not familiar with them and see what's interesting to you. And whichever one wins the voting contest, we will look it up tonight, make sure we know how it works, and create an example for it and go over it tomorrow. All right, so back in Slack. So these are kind of the instructions here, right? So perform a get against tally to list the current. Let's see if I can make. Is there a way to make Slack bigger? Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. So perform a get against the tally to list current overall voting results, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a voting machine, right? Like a voter booth type of thing. So the very first thing you'll do is have a button that goes out to the tally and looks at results, right? So let's take a look at what this does, what this looks like on the website. All right. So this is all that's out there so far. It looks like there's been one vote for Twilio, right? I think Allie voted for that. So API ID, that was the, remember all the APIs had like an ID and then a name. So that's the API ID. API name is Twilio, and it's got one vote for it so far, right? So if you had a tally thing at the top, this is probably going to, yeah, it does. It returns, you notice the bracket arrays, right? What does that mean? What is this returning? What's the data that this is returning? An array, right? Exactly. So over time, as y'all start voting, this is going to be like live. It's going to be like, okay, there may be 4 things in that array. One of them has 2 votes, one of them has 3 votes, that kind of thing, right? You can have a leaderboard. Well, think about ordering and sorting, right? You know a pen too. Like, could you float something to the top of the leaderboard, maybe? You know, have a leaderboard. Have that be dynamically generated based on the results that come back from this, right? So you could have, you could build a table like the previous example. You could have, the API here, and then the current count of votes in the other column. So the second part of this, perform a get against API to list the available APIs to choose from, right? Maybe have another button. You click it, and it's like, here are the available things. It just shows a list, right? Perform a get. So the first 3 of these are gets, and you saw how simple this get right here. You saw how simple that. Whoops, sorry. You saw how simple that is, right? I mean, that's very, very big. That's just one line to do those first 3 things. You got your API URL, which would correspond to these right here, right? These are the URLs for those APIs, and you're going to get back data. It looks like for all those, it's going to be an array, right? What would you do in here if you wanted to kind of list those out, just very simply? What would you do over an array to kind of iterate through it? For loop, right? So I mean, you could start off by writing these to the console, right? For I and array.length, loop over it, show them in your console, then open up then put them in a div tag, right? Have them just display in a div tag. All right, well, let's put them in a table now, iterate on it, like get it kind of working, get a basic thing, get a call working, do your first Ajax call ever, and write it to a console. Then write it to a div, then kind of, start making it pretty, put it in a table, that kind of thing. Work your way up. All right, so this one's the most important one. Perform a post, right, to place your vote, passing a JavaScript object in this shape, right? So the first thing that y'all should do when you start the exercise is go to jQuery's site, and I'm not going to tell you what it looks like, and figure out what $post.post looks like. What is it expecting? We talked about a little bit about URL, and maybe you pass it an object. What does that object need to look like? API name, and the name of the API you'd like goes there. And then you can, if you get super fancy and you wanna remove your vote, and change your mind, you know, this is kind of like the super challenge here. You know, maybe you keep track of your votes and put them in a table, and then maybe you want to go and kind of delete them out. And the code for Ali's code from the morning is right here. If you download the Empower course, you know, do a git pull origin master on the course, you'll get that back. Any other questions before we start? Yeah.
It's set up so that it won't tally a vote from us every time we run our program, right?
I don't know.
Only connect it once.
Check it out. See if you can cheat. So the question was,
Okay.
is it set up to see if you can't vote more than once? I don't know. It takes your GitHub username as part of the parameter.
Right.
So that's the other thing to mention. So right here, these two, this get and this post, where you're seeing your vote and then you're posting your vote. Obviously, you know, it's not your GitHub username here. Put your username in there, right? And so on the server side, what he's doing, he's pulling that chunk of that URL out and using it in his code to store it, you know, in MongoDB to record the votes. But that's a good question. Can you stuff the ballot? I don't know. Go see if you can vote more than once. I will tell you, y'all are probably familiar with podcasts. Like I got into podcasting before, like when MP3 players were like this big and held 10 songs. You know, like really expensive before iPods and everything. They were just, you know, solid state devices that literally held like 10 songs. You had to like switch them out every time. It was a huge pain. But what it was good for was listening to audio podcasts. And there was one where back in the early days, like 2000, 1999, 2000. Back in the early days of podcasting, where they had a site that listed like the most popular ones, right? And they had a contest where you could go and kind of click on which one you want to vote for, and you could stuff the ballot on that. You could clear out. Remember we talked about cookies, so they were using on their site as their defense against that. Like, let's check the cookies to see if somebody's voted before. So when you clicked on the button, it would send you a cookie that say, hey, you've already voted. When you clicked again, they would check your cookie and say, you know, have you voted? Well, you can just clear out your cookie, right? So I had a script that just cleared out your cookie, voted again, clear out your cookie, voted again, you know. And then I called the system admin. He had a Skype thing on there, and I said, hey, you got a vulnerability. You know, I told him I'm a white hat hacker. You know, I told him, you know, hey, you got a vulnerability here, but not after I stuffed the ballot box in my favorite podcast and rose them to the top of the list. So on 3 and 4, go ahead where it says your GitHub username, use yours there, and then this is probably going to be the trickiest one, right? Because gets, again, real simple. Post, you're going to have to send it that JavaScript object block in the right format in order to get it to post correctly. So if you get any errors, have your web tools open, and you're going to do this from a web page, right? You can play with it in Postman. You can play with it, you know, if you pop up in Postman or just pop up in your console. You could play with like doing gets and stuff like that, or doing gets from the URL. When you go to post something, though, go ahead and wire it up to buttons, right? Have a button that says, you know, go check scores, and load it into a spot on your HTML. All right. Anybody in Winston-Salem have any questions? Let's see. Whoa. Okay. After the function, what is it at the end? After done, fail always. Okay. So sorry, there's a big delay on these, but so the answer to that is after this Ajax, you're wiring up, you know, what you want it to do. Then all these done, fail, and always, all these are setting up these callbacks here, right? So you're passing in a function. You're passing in a function. You could chain something on the end of that. On the end of this, you could do something after always. But if you don't, it's just you're sort of done. I mean, you're saying, you know, make this call. When you're done, do this. If you fail, do this. Always do this, and that's it. You've already wired up that. You've already wired up that object, and it's off running and doing its thing. So there is a return type here, but you're not using it. It's like you're just letting it kind of go. Let's see. Okay. Oh, talking about, okay. So Allie's asking, why do we use Ajax versus get versus post? Allie pretending to be a student. So yeah, Ajax, like we said, is sort of the long form, right? You've got all of your different options. You've got, this is that API. If you look at Ajax, you can see how long this is, right? It's got all the different objects. This is sort of, if you're doing something fancy, if you're doing timeouts, if you're sending XML versus JSON, if you're doing something, kind of fancy, this has all the options. This has all the bells and whistles. You can see how big this documentation is. Get is just the shortcut, right? So get is, if you're doing a get, like I said, that this is the shortcut version, right? You can see how small the documentation is. So if you're using Ajax with the most commonly used features, most commonly used defaults, you can get away with like the shortcut, the get, or the the $.get, the $.post, those types of things, those sort of shorter versions of Ajax. Under the covers, it's just calling .ajax with a bunch of defaults set, the most common defaults set. Any other questions? Let's see if there's any in here. Okay. All right. We'll be walking around to help, but again, here are the instructions. Perform a get to see the current list. So the cool thing is, this is going to be, Allie set up a web server, a Node application. Y'all's web apps, y'all's web pages can all call that and see the total the total tally. And as people are voting, it's like when you refresh that or click that button, you've got wired up to that. It's going to be changing on all your apps. Number 2, perform a get on that APIs list just to get a list of things to choose from, to get something, take a look at them and see which ones you're most interested in. You won't get anything back from this until you vote. So if you call the let me see my vote thing before you voted, if you don't swap number 3 and number 4, you're not gonna see anything there. And then number 4, go ahead and perform a post, which will actually put something out in the database. That's going to call the Node web server that he's got set up and put a value in the database and record your vote. And then the next time somebody calls number 1, the tally, they're going to see that. They're going to see that you voted. All right, clear as mud. All right, go ahead and give it a try. If you want to start off using the web browser, it's as simple as this: going here and just call that, right? It's going to do a get. It's like, okay, this is what's coming back. If you want to use Postman to look at a few of the gets, if you want to download that, it's just a Chrome kind of plugin. Again, it just looks like this. So Postman's going to load up once you've got that installed. You can put in the URL. And I don't want to do any of that. Okay, so I'm going to do a get here. I'm going to post that in. And basically this does the same thing, right? I mean, you can do this from a console too. You could do an Ajax get in your console, and show it. So this will kind of show the information that's coming back. A lot of times this puts it kind of in a nicer format. So if you need like a larger display or something like that, you can sort of use it in Postman. So if you try out those first 3 URLs, wherever it says get here, that's just doing a simple get. You're gonna get that information back. But go ahead and wire those up to buttons. I'll go ahead and post this code just so you have an example. I would use this path right here with the get, and then when you do a post, all you change is that to post, and then you put what you're going to post in here. So I'll put a little note for that too. But if in doubt, go just Google for jQuery.post, $.post, and look up the API for that. Start getting in the habit of looking at the documentation. Go to the documentation page and look at what it wants, right? So if you go to, oops, the other thing about Postman is if you've got it set up, it kind of blocks Chrome. It's sort of weird, at least on a Mac. Yeah, so look at on this one, like what does get want? Get wants the URL, and whenever there's a bracket like that on an API, it usually means optional, right? So optionally it wants data. Optionally it wants success, which is a function. This is a callback function that's executed if the request succeeds. And then optionally it's got a data type. Data type it's going to assume, I believe, JSON. Let's see. Oh, okay. The default is intelligent guess. So based on what the server is sending back, it just is like, this looks like JSON, or this looks like HTML or XML, and it sort of does the right thing most of the time. All right, so we will do that for about 45-ish minutes, maybe 10 until 3 or so, and we'll see how everybody's doing at that point. Any other questions from Winston before we get started? All right, everybody get going.